What secret could be so powerful as to endure for centuries shrouded in silence? What led foreign forces to transform an African god into a symbol of fear, when his true nature was movement, balance, and freedom? And why did this distortion persist so deeply that many never questioned its origin? Some questions don't arise by chance. They arise when ancestral memory decides to awaken. The story of this deity reveals a world that doesn't appear in traditional books, a world where African spirituality guided destinies with wisdom that is only now beginning to be rediscovered. By understanding how its image was shaped, hidden, and used as an instrument of control, it becomes impossible to see the past in the same way. The mask of the demon does not reveal its essence. It reveals the fear of those who tried to silence it. And it is this veil that is now lifted. The revelation brings with it an ancient truth, one that does not belong to a specific time, but to all who wish to understand who they are, where they came from, and why so many stories were torn from their African roots. Each symbol, each ritual, and each ancestral word restores depth to what was hidden, showing that nothing was lost, only dormant. If this journey resonates with you, allow this ancestral voice to continue echoing. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment on where in the world you are hearing this revelation from. May ancient wisdom find new paths to follow. There are secrets that reach you like an unexpected shiver. You feel, even before you understand, that something has been hidden for so long that it has almost become forbidden to remember. And yet, the breath of this mystery crosses generations until it reaches your ears. This is how the story of an African god begins. A god who once walked freely among men before being molded in darkness by hands that did not understand him. When you hear his name, even without pronouncing it, you sense an ancient force pulsing there. The peoples who revered him saw him as a guardian of choices, lord of life's crossroads, a presence that opened paths when everything seemed closed. He didn't spread fear, he spread movement. But those who observe the world without knowing its soul often see danger where only power exists. And that is exactly what happened when foreigners arrived bringing preconceived ideas and fear of the incomprehensible. Witnessing dances that uplifted the spirit, drums that summoned ancestors, and symbols that united heaven and earth, they decided that none of that should exist. They tried to clothe the god in shadows that did not belong to him, creating a distorted image to justify the destruction of what they could not control. But despite all the distortions, his essence never faded. In every preserved corner, in every hidden gesture of faith, in every corner that survived in the memory of his descendants, his presence remained alive. It's as if he only waited for someone, perhaps you, to look deeper and realize that no mask created by foreigners can silence a divinity born from the soul of a people. And within this setting marked by profound rhythms and the very breath of the earth, one detail stands out. Everything seemed connected by a silent harmony, as if the entire region held the presence of the god in every daily gesture. The spiritual force that circulated there flowed without interruption, sustaining an order that spanned generations. However, behind this ancestral tranquility, discreet, almost imperceptible movements emerged, announcing that old certainties would soon be challenged. The presence of this deity emerges at a time when the world was still learning to balance between silence and movement. At the primitive crossroads, where nothing had a definitive form, a force awakened like a spark that decides to become a flame. There was no voice to announce it. There was only the instant in which the earth itself recognized that something essential had arrived. His essence manifested as energy that traversed layers of the visible and the sacred. The breath of the air changed when he approached, and the atmosphere seemed to make room to accommodate his presence. He did not appear as a rigid figure, but as a living principle, capable of shaping paths and offering meaning to what was previously only doubt scattered throughout the world. Multiplicity was part of his nature. He assumed symbolic forms that represented what the moment demanded: movement, choice, passage. Nothing about him was static, and this fluidity reflected the human condition itself. Therefore, his strength did not come from imposing direction, but from revealing possibilities where before only confusion was seen. Its origin is marked by the encounter between opposites that coexist without conflict. Light and shadow intertwine in its essence, without hierarchy, without dispute. The harmony between these forces allows one to understand the totality of existence, and this understanding awakens profound respect. For its people, this deity did not represent fear, but the wisdom that arises from inner balance. With each new cycle, his presence expanded along the paths, contours, and boundaries that connected different worlds. Crossroads became places of encounter, pause, and decision, charged with the energy he established from the beginning of time. And, as this force spread across the land, a new movement began to insinuate itself, bringing signs of changes that still awaited the right moment to emerge. In the spaces where spiritual life pulsed most intensely, the rituals dedicated to this deity unfolded as movements that united earth and sky. Drums marked the rhythm of the night, vibrating like a giant heart that guided every gesture of the people. The air filled with burning herbs, releasing perfumes that seemed to awaken something ancient in the body and soul. Nothing was improvised, every detail carried profound meaning. The hands of the initiates drew symbols on the damp clay floor, lines that represented paths, choices, and invisible forces. These signs were not meant to decorate the space, but to open doors between different planes. When the lines were completed, the atmosphere acquired its own density, as if the entire environment understood that something sacred was about to happen. It was there that the presence of the divine found passage. The chants elevated the ritual's energy, guiding spirits and memories to align in a single pulse. The voices merged in layers, creating a sound that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Each verse held intention, and each variation in rhythm represented a conversation with the invisible. The music was not just sound, it was a bridge, a request, a recognition. At the center of the rituals, offerings were placed with firm and respectful gestures. Fruits, roots, drinks, metal objects, all chosen to honor the force that governs movement and destiny. Around them, flames flickered as if responding to a presence that didn't need to be seen to be perceived. It was in this environment that the divinity manifested itself through subtle signs, like an unexpected breeze or a sudden change in the rhythm of the drums. And while these rituals kept alive the connection between the human and the sacred, a silent perception began to emerge. Something external was approaching these practices with eyes incapable of understanding their meaning. The depth of these symbols, so natural to the people who lived them, became the target of distant and strange interpretations, preparing the ground for conflicts that still lay dormant in the shadows. Over the centuries, the lands that held the presence of this deity began to receive visitors with intentions different from those of the local people. Strangers arrived with rigid beliefs and a narrow view of everything that escaped their own understanding. For them, African spirituality was not an expression of ancestral wisdom, but something that needed to be molded, silenced, or replaced. Thus began a period of tension that would span generations. The rituals, once celebrated openly, came under the watchful eye of those who saw a threat where only tradition existed. Sacred symbols were reinterpreted in a distorted way, treated as signs of danger and not as paths to knowledge. The attempt to impose new beliefs acted as a force that pushed into the shadows everything that did not fit into the narrative of the newcomers. And the more they tried to control, the more violent the judgments became. The persecutions intensified, reaching spiritual leaders, masters of knowledge, and guardians of stories. Many were forced to abandon practices that had sustained their communities since time immemorial. Others resisted in silence, preserving every gesture, every song, every rite hidden under the cloak of night. The divinity, once celebrated without reservation, came to be seen by the invaders as a figure that needed to be fought, not understood. With the advance of colonization, distortions multiplied in books, speeches, and official records. The divinity that represented movement and balance acquired dark labels created by those who feared what they could not control. The erasure did not only happen in practices, it affected the collective memory, attempting to rewrite the very identity of a people. However, the essence of the sacred resisted in subtle forms, preserved in music, gestures, and the oral heritage that stubbornly persisted. And while these external forces redefined territories and imposed new truths, something remained intact, the flame that refused to be extinguished. Behind the masks created by the colonizers, the presence of divinity still pulsed, awaiting the moment when its true image would re-emerge before those who sought to understand the past without imposed filters. As time progressed and the scars left by colonization began to be examined more carefully, discoveries emerged that shed new light on this deity. Excavations revealed wrought iron objects, sculptures laden with symbolism, and fragments of ancient temples that had been swallowed by the forest. Each artifact bore marks that defied imposed interpretations and restored strength to the history they had tried to silence. Texts recovered from forgotten collections presented precise descriptions of rituals, sacred names, and practices that directly engaged with traditions preserved only orally. In some of these records, the deity appeared as a spiritual guide and not as a shadowy figure, contradicting centuries of distortion. Reading these documents revealed a wisdom that transcended borders and endured even after long periods of repression. At the same time, scholars began to notice spiritual connections between this African deity and entities from other ancient cultures. It wasn't a matter of copying or direct influence, but a profound similarity that pointed to universal patterns of human spirituality. Guardians of paths, messengers between worlds, forces of balance, themes that emerged in different regions, as if distant civilizations shared similar sacred instincts. These discoveries sparked renewed interest and brought a sense of reunion. Archaeology, anthropology, and spirituality walked hand in hand, revealing connections that had been ignored or erased. Each new find dismantled a fragment of the narrative constructed by the colonizers, showing that the past contained more nuances than any official record dared to admit. And as these traces emerged from the earth, something deeper was revealed: the realization that the history of this deity still holds unrevealed layers. Signs scattered throughout temples, objects, and songs suggest that there is much more to be discovered, as if time itself were willing to reveal what has remained hidden. When the colonizers realized that African spirituality could not be destroyed by simple prohibitions, they began to treat it as a political threat. They knew that a people connected to their gods kept their own identity alive, and that no external authority could completely dominate those who preserved such deep roots. Therefore, they transformed spiritual attacks into a tool of control, directly targeting the deities that represented freedom, movement, and autonomy. Demonization was not an accident, nor the result of religious misunderstanding. It was a calculated strategy. By labeling a deity as malevolent, the colonizers justified harsher interference, cultural erasure, and punishments that previously lacked justification. The distorted image served as a psychological weapon, creating fear where trust once existed. Thus, they shook the bond between the people and that which had guided them since time immemorial. Foreign institutions reinforced this narrative, repeating discourses that associated sacred African forces with darkness and witchcraft. The absence of logic or evidence didn't matter; it was enough to insist for the stigma to take root. The colonizers understood that by destroying the prestige of a deity, they broke the structure that sustained spiritual leaders, rituals, and traditions. It was a subtle, yet powerful, way of rewriting what it meant to exist in that territory. Meanwhile, official documents and missionary accounts spread convenient and alarmist versions, shaping external perceptions of African spirituality. What was once a symbol of choice, transformation, and balance came to be described as deceit and evil. The repetition of these distortions amplified political control, allowing rulers to interfere in social organization with less resistance. Spiritual manipulation became a silent cog in a larger system. But even amidst this pressure, something remained unshaken: the ancestral memory that refused to accept the imposed mask. And beneath this surface of oppression, a discreet, almost invisible feeling grew that one day the truth would find its way back. As the transatlantic slave trade intensified, spirituality crossed the ocean along with those torn from their lands. Chains could bind bodies, but they could not imprison the memory of a divinity that walked between worlds. In the dark holds of ships, where the heavy air mingled pain and resistance, the presence of this sacred being remained silent, sustaining the hope of those who clung to what still made sense. The journey, marked by storms and loss, created a deep wound that never fully healed. Even so, African spirituality remained alive in whispered thoughts, shared dreams, and gestures that survived in disguise. The divinity, once openly venerated, became an invisible support amidst suffering, a reminder of a freedom that no one could take away. Upon arriving in the Americas, those who survived found a hostile world, structured to erase any trace of their culture. Authorities forbade rituals, suppressed languages, and punished spiritual expressions. Even so, traditions resurfaced in improvised songs, subtle movements, and hidden celebrations. Divinity crossed borders unseen, adapting to the harshest conditions and remaining a point of ancestral strength. This resistance manifested itself in syncretisms that allowed the sacred to continue under a new guise. African elements were combined with imposed symbols, creating secret codes that only the initiated understood. The divinity walked through these disguises, preserving its essence while hiding from watchful eyes. Thus, it kept alive the flame that illuminated generations torn from their homeland. And with this flame, spread across different regions of the American continent, a silent question lingered in the air. How could something so deeply repressed remain alive, waiting only for the right moment to reveal its true form again? Over time, the presence of this deity in foreign lands began to be shaped by interpretations from abroad, almost always distant from its original essence. The colonizers, unable to understand the balance between light and shadow that made up its nature, began to associate it with figures that represented fear and punishment in their own traditions. This forced fusion distorted symbols and gestures that were once expressions of wisdom and transformation. European images of horns, fire, and temptation began to occupy the space that previously belonged to symbols of movement, passage, and choice. What was once mere ignorance transformed into an authoritarian narrative, repeated until it became belief. The African deity was pushed into a role that never belonged to it, clothed in forms that contradicted everything it represented. And the more these distortions were propagated, the more difficult it became to distinguish the real from the imposed. Local authorities reinforced these fabrications, incorporating them into sermons, laws, and records. This process not only distanced people from their own roots but also created emotional and spiritual barriers that took generations to overcome. The demonized image became a tool of control, reinforcing the idea that African spirituality needed to be feared and abandoned, not understood or respected. Even so, those who carried the ancestral memory knew that something was wrong with that interpretation. The traditions passed down in silence showed that the true form of divinity was far more complex and profound than any caricature created by the colonizers. In discreet gestures, in hidden signs in everyday life, the original essence continued to flow, like an underground current that resists the weight of the stones that try to block it. And as this current continued its invisible course, an inevitable question arose. What would happen when the imposed masks began to fall and divinity could finally reclaim the place that had been taken from it? As the persecution intensified, African spirituality found refuge where it was least expected, in the silence of long nights, in almost inaudible chants, and in movements that only those who knew the sacred could recognize. The resistance did not emerge as open confrontation, but as discreet persistence, linked to the memory of a people who knew that no external force would be able to extinguish that which was born from the essence of the soul. Clandestine religious centers emerged in improvised spaces, shaped by hands that carried generations of knowledge. There, far from watchful eyes, the energy of the divine flowed unimpeded. Each gesture marked on the ground, each muffled drum so as not to attract attention, reaffirmed the presence of the sacred. It was as if the spirit of resistance danced among the shadows, keeping the tradition alive even when everything seemed to crumble. Adapted rituals emerged as a way to protect what could not be lost. Chants that once echoed openly transformed into discreet melodies, mixed with seemingly ordinary work songs or prayers. The divinity, enveloped by new codes, remained present. Its strength traveled hidden paths, sustaining hope and strengthening the identity of those who never gave up on their roots. Syncretism also became a refuge. Figures imposed by the colonizers came to serve as temporary masks, preserving the true meaning behind permitted images. Thus, the divinity walked hidden, protected by symbols that disguised its true nature. This strategy allowed the cult to survive intact, even in environments where any deviation from the established rules was severely punished. And within this silent network of protection, something was taking shape: the certainty that, however deep the oppression, African spirituality would always find a way to endure. This stubborn flame proclaimed that the sacred would never disappear. It was merely waiting for the moment when it could emerge again in all its strength. Among forgotten ruins and paths where time seems to move slowly, sacred artifacts endured as silent witnesses to all that happened. Sculptures of iron, wood, and clay emerged from unlikely hiding places, bearing marks that no persecution could erase. Each piece held a fragment of the divinity's presence, as if its spirit had found refuge in matter. Even after centuries of oppression, these objects continued to pulsate with ancestral energy. Some of these artifacts featured shapes that suggested movement, open doors, and intersecting paths, symbols that acknowledged divinity as the guardian of journeys. Others displayed geometric features that organized chaos into precise patterns, revealing a sophisticated understanding of balance and destiny. Nothing there was merely decorative; everything carried spiritual intent, representing a silent conversation between humans and unseen forces. Many of these objects had been hidden during periods of heightened vigilance, protected in caves, hollow tree trunks, and places inaccessible only to initiates. They were carried as talismans, preserved within families who passed down their meanings from generation to generation. With each reunion, the energy contained in these artifacts rekindled deep memories, bringing together fragments of a history they had tried to silence, but which had never been completely lost. When modern scholars began to analyze these pieces, they realized that their forms defied simplistic explanations. There was technique, order, and intention there that contradicted the narrative of backwardness imposed by the colonizers. These objects exposed a complex spiritual system, aligned with astronomical, philosophical, and symbolic knowledge. What had been called superstition revealed itself, in fact, as an expression of a refined worldview. And as more artifacts are found, the feeling arises that many still sleep beneath the earth, awaiting the moment to reappear. Each piece returned to the world expands the understanding of this deity, opening space for revelations that are yet to emerge. Over generations, stories once threatened by silence found new life in the voices of griots and priests who refused to allow the sacred to disappear. They gathered fragments scattered throughout the people's memory, loose verses, ancient gestures, ownerless melodies, and carefully pieced them together with ritualistic care, like someone mending a broken jewel. In each restored word, the presence of the divine rekindled, firm and inescapable. The recovered legends revealed forgotten facets, bringing to light the wisdom that transcended turbulent times. They showed divinity as a force that guided difficult choices, as a protector of paths, and as a guardian of secrets that shaped destinies. These narratives did not merely seek to recount a myth, they restored identity, reminding the people that their roots remained alive even after long periods of oppression. The griots chanted these stories with a rhythm that seemed to emerge from the very ground. The cadence of the sounds created vivid images, as if each phrase opened doors to invisible worlds. Meanwhile, the priests preserved rituals that accompanied these narratives, reinforcing the link between history and spirituality. The knowledge transmitted in conversation circles and nightly ceremonies stitched together past and present with the same precision as someone weaving a sacred fabric. The reconstruction of these legends was not rushed. It was a process guided by ancestral intuition, which found meaning in the small clues left by the ancestors. Some stories revealed teachings about balance, others spoke of protection, journeys, and transformation. All carried the mark of divinity, shrouded in mystery that survived attempts at erasure. Each restored account gave strength to what lay dormant. And as these narratives resurfaced, a new feeling began to grow, the realization that there are still buried stories, waiting for the moment to be awakened. The echoes of these legends point to secrets that continue to resist time, as if calling out to those who are ready to hear them. As new studies emerged, careful comparisons began to reveal something surprising. The African deity, so marked by its role as guardian of passages, possessed parallels with revered figures in distant cultures. Without direct contact between these cultures, similar concepts arose as reflections of the same universal archetype. This sparked profound questions about the origin and recurrence of these spiritual forces throughout human history. In ancient civilizations, messengers between worlds appeared as essential figures, responsible for connecting the divine to everyday life. These beings shared characteristics with the African deity: mastery over paths, ability to move between realities, and a central role in the choices that guided destinies. The similarity did not point to copying, but to a spiritual harmony that seemed to transcend borders and eras. These associations, however, faced resistance for a long time. Recognizing that African traditions contained complexity equivalent to that of widely studied cultures meant dismantling colonial narratives used to justify inferiority. Therefore, for centuries, these connections were ignored, minimized, or treated as undue coincidences. But the more evidence emerged, the harder it became to maintain the silence. Comparisons also revealed that the balance between light and shadow, present in the essence of this deity, echoed in distinct mythologies. In different regions, entities representing transition, movement, and choice occupied fundamental positions in spiritual structures. This repetition suggested that humanity instinctively recognized the importance of these forces in understanding the flow of life. And the African version, far from being an exception, revealed singular depth. With each new connection revealed, understanding of this deity expanded, showing that its story was not isolated. Clues scattered throughout the world's myths indicated that hidden links still exist, woven together by paths that await closer observation to be fully understood. New investigations have brought to the surface evidence that had remained hidden for centuries. Fragments of temples, artifacts buried beneath layers of ancient soil, and traces of rituals preserved by the earth itself have begun to emerge in regions marked by the presence of the deity. Each find seemed to liberate a piece of the past, as if the physical world were responding to the desire to recover what had been forcibly forgotten. Metal sculptures revealed details that defied the distortions imposed by the colonizers. Figures with arms intertwined in circular movements, precisely engraved symbols, and geometric patterns repeated with spiritual intent showed an advanced understanding of rhythm, balance, and destiny. These objects, when analyzed closely, restored depth to the image of divinity and dismantled simplistic interpretations. Remains of ancient altars showed signs of complex rituals, composed of carefully combined natural elements. Fragments of pottery displayed paintings depicting intersecting paths, symbolic portals, and figures that guided spiritual journeys. These vestiges indicated that the relationship between the people and their sacred objects was much broader than any record had previously allowed one to believe. Beyond the physical artifacts, inscriptions recovered on rocks and walls of ancient ceremonial spaces revealed terms and expressions that connected directly to narratives preserved orally. This encounter between archaeology and tradition reinforced the continuity of African spirituality, showing that nothing there was created by chance. Divinity held a central place in a symbolic system that spanned centuries. The sum of this evidence creates a picture that is still far from being fully understood. Each recent discovery indicates that there are deep layers waiting to be revealed, as if the Earth continues to guard secrets that choose the exact moment to emerge. The demonization imposed by the colonizers was not limited to the spiritual realm. It reached intimate regions of identity, shaping perceptions and generating wounds that span generations. By associating divinity with negative images, colonial power directly interfered with how many came to see themselves. The sacred, once a source of strength and balance, was transformed into a cause for shame, opening space for internal conflicts that are difficult to name. This spiritual rupture created deep tensions within the communities. Some came to believe in the imposed distortions, fearing what their own ancestors venerated. Others struggled to preserve the knowledge, even feeling the weight of persecution and doubt. The divided identity between external imposition and ancestral memory formed a delicate emotional terrain, where traditions needed to be guarded with extreme care. The psychological impact also manifested itself in the collective perception of cultural value. Stories, symbols, and rights came to be seen as obstacles to social acceptance within colonial structures. This devaluation generated silence, alienation, and even attempts to abandon deep roots. What was once a source of pride became a field of conflict, revealing the emotional reach of forced reinterpretation. Even so, deep within many families, the memory of divinity remained alive. In subtle gestures, in teachings passed down without fanfare, in small objects cherished with affection, a feeling of belonging persisted, refusing to be extinguished. This silent bond kept alive layers of identity that were constantly threatened by external discourses. And over time, this invisible thread of memory began to awaken intense questions. After all, what force is this capable of surviving so much repression and still pulsating within those who don't always understand its origin? The answer continues to echo, waiting for those who wish to listen beyond the imposed voices. In the 21st century, something began to move with renewed force. The search for identity, previously stifled by centuries of repression, found fertile ground among descendants who wished to understand their roots without the imposed distortions. The divinity that had traversed time under layers of silence re-emerged as a legitimate presence, bringing with it the echo of a history that refused to disappear. Cultural and spiritual movements have given new meaning to ancient practices, revealing to the world a tradition that has not only endured but transformed itself. Young people, scholars, and community leaders have begun to reclaim symbols, rituals, and narratives that had been hidden or reconfigured over the centuries. In each reunion, there is a feeling of recovering something that has always been there, waiting for recognition. Technological advancements have also amplified this reconnection. Digital records, independent research, and the exchange of knowledge between communities scattered around the world have created unexpected bridges. African spirituality has gained new spaces for expression, allowing ancient wisdom to be shared without the colonial filters that imprisoned it for so long. The presence of divinity has found new ways to exist. With the strengthening of this ancestral heritage, festivals, houses of worship, and study groups began to value the complexity of African traditions even more. What was once seen as superstition gained the status of cultural heritage, revealing a symbolic richness recognized worldwide. Each encounter with the sacred ignited memories that could not be contained or shaped by external narratives. And within this growing movement, a silent question was forming. How far can this spiritual rebirth take us, now that ancestral voices are beginning to be heard clearly again? As studies, evidence, and memories intertwine, a revelation emerges that completely changes the way we see the past. The figure demonized by Europe was nothing more than the distorted shadow of a deity representing movement, choice, and balance. The idea of evil was never part of its essence. It was added by hands seeking to control what they did not understand. When this truth begins to emerge, many certainties crumble like dust in the wind. By carefully observing ancestral symbols, rituals, and narratives, it becomes evident that the deity possessed attributes that guided life, not destroyed it. Its colors, gestures, and energy pointed towards paths of spiritual wisdom that helped communities overcome profound challenges. The supposed darkness associated with it was nothing more than the projection of a foreign gaze incapable of accepting the plurality of the African sacred. This revelation also exposes the mechanism that sustained the demonization: fear, political influence, and the need for dominance. Transforming a god into a demon facilitated the imposition of external beliefs and weakened cultural resistance. But over time, the mask created by the colonizers revealed its flaws. The ancestral strength remained intact, protected by secret rituals, preserved stories, and memories that never fully succumbed to oblivion. When this truth comes to light, something profound happens. The understanding that African spirituality was never linked to the shadows attributed to it. What was called danger was, in fact, an expression of spiritual autonomy. What was treated as a threat was a symbol of freedom. What was condemned as chaos was a celebration of the complexity of existence. This realization restores dignity to a tradition that had been torn from its place. And in recovering this true image, space opens up for a new question. If this divinity has been so profoundly distorted, how many other stories are still waiting to be revealed with the clarity that time has insisted on restoring? In today's world, the revelation about this divinity resonates like a silent wave that crosses borders and awakens consciences. Many people are beginning to question inherited narratives and realize that the demonization of the African sacred was not merely a religious mistake, but part of a broader project of control and domination. This new understanding restores balance to conversations about identity, faith, and belonging, allowing previously suppressed memories to find space to flourish. African spirituality, once marginalized, is now gaining prominence among groups seeking reconnection with their origins. The return to ancestral practices strengthens social movements, inspires political debates, and promotes the appreciation of cultures that have long been considered inferior. The symbolic presence of divinity acts as a beacon, guiding discussions that range from racial issues to the rediscovery of family traditions. This impact also manifests itself in the emotional realm. Many people find comfort in realizing that the sacred elements that were taken from them were not a source of fear, but a source of strength and wisdom. Healing from historical stigma opens doors to new forms of spirituality built with pride and awareness. Even those who do not practice the rituals feel the importance of understanding the cultural depth they carry. Art is another dimension transformed by this revelation. Music, cinema, literature, and painting begin to incorporate ancestral symbols with more respect and authenticity. Divinity returns as a legitimate inspiration, illuminating songs, cultural movements, and works that value African memory. Each artistic expression becomes a form of reaffirmation, reconstructing the place of the African sacred in the contemporary imagination. And as this force spreads, the realization emerges that history is still in the process of being reconstructed. The past is not closed, and the present continues to receive signals that invite us to see more deeply what has been hidden for so long. Even after centuries of repression and distortion, the essence of this divinity remained intact in the deepest layers of collective memory. No matter how many times they tried to impose new interpretations, the spiritual truth that accompanied it survived like an ember hidden beneath dense ashes. With each generation, this ember would shine again when someone dared to seek meaning beyond what was taught by the colonizers. The songs, even transformed by time, preserved rhythmic patterns that kept alive the connection with the sacred. Seemingly ordinary objects carried marks that echoed the presence of this ancestral force. Small gestures repeated without conscious explanation revealed fragments of ancient rituals that resisted attempts at erasure. It was as if the divinity had found its own ways to remain in the world, even when everything seemed lost. Ancestry functioned as an invisible thread guiding history, sustaining traditions that could not be completely uprooted. In communities scattered across different continents, the same feeling arose, that there was something greater, silent, pulsating behind each recovered symbol. The spirituality kept secret continued to generate new meanings each time someone approached it with respect. This persistent presence also manifested itself in dreams, intuitions, and perceptions that permeated the collective imagination. From time to time, a spiritual impulse arose, calling for a return to one's roots, as if divinity were reminding the world that its story had not yet been fully told. The past insisted on dialoguing with the present, challenging the versions that attempted to silence it. And faced with this force that has never yielded to oblivion, the expectation grows to understand what this ancestral resilience still has to reveal. Something seems to be approaching, as if yet another layer of mystery is ready to emerge from the silence that has protected it for so long. In current times, the rediscovery of this divinity reignites profound questions about how humanity perceives the sacred. Realizing that its image has been distorted by external interests, many are beginning to revisit the roots that underpin their own perceptions of the world. The ancestral truth, previously stifled by colonial narratives, returns as a force that reorganizes identities and broadens the understanding of African spirituality. This reclaiming of faith is not limited to the religious field. It touches on politics, education, and social movements that fight to restore the dignity of historically silenced peoples. The symbolic presence of the deity inspires debates about belonging, collective memory, and cultural appreciation. Each step in this direction reveals how much has been lost, and how much can be rebuilt when ancestral wisdom is honored. The power of this revelation also awakens something essential, the understanding that spirituality and identity go hand in hand. By recovering the true face of this divinity, communities realize that they have inherited not shadows, but transformative lights. Awareness of this legacy strengthens self-esteem and gives current generations the possibility of redefining their own narrative, without the filters imposed by centuries of oppression. New artistic expressions, research, and cultural practices are beginning to emerge as fruits of this renaissance. Divinity reappears in music, films, paintings, and celebrations that reclaim its original symbolism. This creative expansion acts as a bridge between past and future, showing that ancestral force has not only survived but continues to inspire paths yet unimagined. And as this movement grows, there's a feeling that we're only scratching the surface of a much greater understanding. The story of this deity resurfaces, full of echoes and possibilities, inviting the listener to delve deeper, where other mysteries await revelation. The revelation comes to an end like the last flame of an ancient bonfire. It doesn't go out, it merely awaits the next breath to be reborn. The story of this divinity, snatched from the light and cast into shadow by invaders, shows that no human power is capable of silencing forever that which is born from the soul of a people. The African sacred crossed oceans, resisted captivity, survived the imposition of foreign narratives, and now returns with the strength of something that has always belonged to all those who carry memory in their steps. Africa's spiritual legacy reveals more than beliefs. It reveals a way of being that honors movement, balance, and ancestry. Each recovered symbol, each restored song, and each preserved gesture rekindles the dignity they tried to extinguish. And in understanding who was truly transformed into a demon, it becomes impossible to ignore the depth of all that remains hidden, waiting for new voices that wish to listen. The story doesn't end here. Beneath the sands of time, other secrets sleep, other divinities, other entire civilizations that vibrate in the darkness, awaiting the right moment to awaken. Each discovery opens the way to another, like successive doors leading to a truth greater than any repression could contain. May this revelation walk with those who have heard it. May it inspire respect, curiosity, and reconnection with the roots that sustain so many peoples around the world. And may it serve as an invitation to continue this journey between shadows and light, where the past and the present meet in one spirit. If you wish to continue receiving these ancestral stories, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Other truths await your arrival.